getting to know more of Ukraine and what's happening there in also a broader context, and why it came that Ukraine is fighting for freedom and European values right now. I am a part of an organization called Ukrainian Dialogues. We are a group of activists who are really interested in telling our Western allies more about Ukraine. And one of the reasons for that is that we noticed that actually, if you think about Ukraine has not been that much in the Western sphere of discussion, probably up until 2013 or 14, when the Revolution of Dignity happened. And this is more or less a natural situation because, as many other normal countries, we don't invest lots of our GDP to create some propaganda image abroad. But because we are in what Russia was thinking Russian sphere of influence, we were part of their narratives, which of course have never put whatever was pro-independence in Ukraine into a good perspective. So of course more information about Ukraine has started resurfacing with the first invasion in Crimea and Donbass, and now with a full-scale war. But what was also interesting is that I would say that the civilized world came a little unprepared to this war, because many people on the highest level, including, were expecting that Ukraine will fall within days, weeks, months at best. And here we are, 1 year after that. And today I would like to talk a little bit more about the potential causes for that, how it came that Ukraine could actually resist one of the biggest armies in the world. And it's also a peculiar thing to think about that Ukraine, that has not been discussed so much now, is in the center. And before starting, I would like to quote Timothy Snyder, a famous historian, who said that Ukraine is in the absolute center of many events that we consider key. It is in the center of the First and Second World Wars, in the center of Stalin's terror, the Holocaust, in the center of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ukraine today is in the center of the great modern events, and because of this, it is difficult to see and notice it, because those things which are most important are often the most poorly illuminated, and Ukraine very often became the heart of this darkness. So let's go to where it all started, more or less, in terms of statehood on the Ukrainian territories. And we'll have to travel to the medieval times and the times of Kievan Rus, or actually Rus, because according to the objective historians, there was only one Rus, and it was only later that the Russian historians started calling Kievan, Moscovian Rus, and so on. So actually, it's very interesting and important to say here in Denmark that the ties between Rus and Danish Vikings is very, very tight, because it is believed that Rus has been founded by the descendants of Danish Vikings, one of which called Rurik or Hadark, who lent a start of one of the ruling dynasties in Rus. So Rus was actually situated in the path that was called the path from Varangians to Greeks. And it's interesting to think about, because now Ukraine is considered in the dichotomy East and West, but essentially Ukraine was even more interestingly connecting South and North. And that's how it came to be such an interesting place for these trade routes. And it was a flourishing country that has actually been pretty connected to the rest of Europe. So we know that Yaroslav the Wise, one of the grand princes of Rus, has been called father-in-law of Europe, because that's how many countries he had marital ties with at that point, which only testifies to the significance of Rus and the Western civilization. It's also important to point out that the legislation in Rus was pretty for those times advanced. It didn't have a capital punishment, for example, and physical punishment was also only used for males. And at that time, Moscow was not really anywhere. So every time they claim some historic superiority, it's kind of really bizarre, to be honest. So going further, we'll have to face an important historical event which has changed the game on the Eurasian continent, being the Golden Horde. So the Mongolian invasion of large portions of land, both in Asia and in Europe, which has changed the geopolitical maps a lot. But here is when we completely part our ways with the territories of the northern neighbor, which came into occupation by the Golden Horde and has spent several centuries like that, while the main parts of Ukraine become allies and eventually one country with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. It was not by conquest, it was just the agreement between the nobilities. And it's important to say that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania completely adopted the Kievan Rus legislation and culture, so this is a true descendant. And it was again looking pretty much westward, while at the same time the other parts of the land that has been part of the Rus before were under Mongolian occupation, which has had a number of features different from there, like highly hierarchical society with the Khan deciding literally everything, both about commoners and nobility, which was completely different in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and I think it's already echoing kind of modern times and common customs in Russia. They return capital punishment and broadly use torture, just a few interesting features. So it's also important to point out that Ukrainian lands, even though not being occupied by the Golden Horde, were still damaged because many of the major battles were taking part out there. So eventually it turned out that Ukrainian lands, hence Ukrainian nobility, were decreasing their role in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And then part of nobility, as well as commoners, have grown a bit unhappy about their rights out there, because while they were protecting the country on the south, they were not granted these you could say rights as the rest of nobility. And nobility was doing pretty well in Grand Duchy of Lithuania and later Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So they started actually their own movement for independence, and that's how the Cossack state arose. So the Cossacks were those warriors who were essentially protecting the country from the south, and also it combined both nobility that actually was really fond of what was in Kievan Rus called Vicha, which is essentially something similar to Ting in Viking times. That's again another testimony to the connections between Scandinavia and Ukraine. And with those actually customs, they created this Cossack state or hetmanat from the word hetman or hetman, which is the head of state, which was elected and which had to report to the people who elected him, which was pretty rare at that time, even in many European countries. So it's important to say that this image of Cossack, because as a commoners who joined the Cossack state, they were often serfs who escaped their serfancy and to become these free warriors. So of course such an image is inspiring people up until now, and of course inspires the soldiers who fight on the front lines right now, as you can see with the specific appearance of Cossacks with this what is called chu, this specific long flock of hair, and so on. So that is a big inspiration, and even for our anthem there are lines saying, "We'll not spare either our soul or bodies to get freedom, and will prove that we brothers are of Cossack kin." So the only thing that Cossacks were not too good at is forming alliances, and at some point they thought that if the religion is the same, then they can form alliance with Moscow, which completely used that to just take over Cossack state, and eventually, because Cossacks were rebellious and several times tried to turn to Western Europe again, they were destroyed by Catherine II in a very insidious overnight attack. And for a while, Ukrainian resistance in a more organized way were really suppressed, even though the ideas of that were floating around a lot. So at the next major historical point, we will go to the 20th century, where the Russian Empire falls apart because of the Bolsheviks taking over the power during the Red Revolution, and Ukrainians pursuing their independence take the chance to establish Ukrainian state, which was called Ukrainian National Republic. So it's more or less was happening 100 years ago, the war between Ukraine and Bolsheviks, but interestingly it combines and has lots and lots of similarities to the current war. because at that point Ukraine was also turning to the West, trying to get some support and help. Unfortunately, that was not provided, so Ukraine has fallen victim to the Bolshevik occupation and has been forcefully joining the Soviet Union. So, of course, even if you occupy something and join it, that does not kill the rebellious spirit of people. And interestingly, the specific feature was that it was so ingrained in people that even peasants were very rebellious. And that led eventually to one of the biggest tragedies of 20th century in our land, which is called Holodomor, terror famine, of 32-33, which was essentially artificially designed famine in order to oppress and drive the peasants into submission. So everything was taken away from people of one of the most fertile lands in Europe, which led to a huge number of deaths, which is difficult to estimate right now, and different historians say that it's from 3.5 to 10 millions, and because it was such a silenced crime, it's difficult to establish the actual numbers. And I would say that it's still a trauma that we have not processed, because it was completely prohibited to talk about that in the society, but each of us Ukrainians have known about it from the experience of our grandparents or grand-grandparents, and it's still there in the society in some attitudes towards scarcity and so on. If you want to know more about those events, I would highly recommend you to check out the book by Anne Applebaum called Stalin's War on Ukraine. It's called The Red Famine, and actually you can also help to admit on the official level that these events were genocide, because essentially when this terror famine was happening, the borders of Ukrainian Soviet Republic has been closed, which marks that it was specifically targeted for the people who lived in those lands. So you can check out and go to the boafoslay.dk and sign the petition asking Danish government to recognize it as the genocide, which has been recognized by many, many countries, both in Europe and in America. So I think it would be a natural step to that. It's also important to mention here that the oppression of Ukrainian language and culture was also happening throughout all the years that Ukrainian territories have been part of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. There were many, many instances of complete prohibition of usage of Ukrainian language for both common use as well as printing press releases, and even releasing the printed songs and so on and so forth. So many, many cultural figures have fallen victims to those oppressions, because it's of course were not just fines or something, it was usually killings of those people, and that has been crippling both Ukrainian identity as well as cultural sphere for a really, really long time. It didn't pass too long before Ukraine ended up in another central event for the 20th century, meaning the Second World War. It's very important from all dimensions if you think about these events, because first of all, this is has marked huge losses for Ukraine, because 100% of Ukrainian territory had been occupied. If you compare it to Russia, who claims to be the main victim and main victor of this war, it's been only 3% of territory. Most of the major battles also took place in the territory of Ukraine, Belarus and Baltic states, which of course cannot go away without a trace. So Ukrainians has lost around 22% of population, and the total loss of both migrated people, it accounts for 34%. With material losses for economy being 40%. So nevertheless, it's very important to point out that, especially in the current rhetorics, Russia is using the myth of the Second World War very actively, opposing itself to the Western world and not acknowledging any contribution of any, not only allies, but also other republics of Soviet Union, which, taking this part into consideration, is very bizarre, but that's where we are. It's also important to point out that while Russia tries to blame some Ukrainians for so-called collaboration with Hitler, in fact, those forces for the most part of the war were fighting both dictatorships, both Hitler and Stalin. And here I would like to provide a quote by Stalin in 1945 after victory, who completely put aside all of the contributions of other people and other nations, saying that I drink first of all to the health of the Russian people because they are the most outstanding nation among all the nations that are part of the Soviet Union. Because they have earned in this war universal recognition as the leading power of the Soviet Union among all nations of the country. It's also a kind of bizarre rhetorics for a person who claims to have defeated Nazism, I think, but here we are, and of course Putin, playing along with Stalinist attitudes, said 13 years ago that we would have won the war equally because we are a nation of winners, and the Russian Socialist Republic suffered the greatest losses. In the war, more than 70%, the war was won primarily to the expense of the resources of Russian Federation. So you can see how there is not at all an acknowledgement of any other contributions and how there is an opposition between Russia and the rest of the world who are also fighting. If you want to know a little more about the fate of these regions, of course including Ukraine, please check out the book by Timothy Snyder called The Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin. So, going further, after the Second World War, Ukrainian resistance was still out there, and even though being suppressed, the ideas of independence were flourishing among people. And as soon as the weakness of Soviet Union has been actively exposed, especially in the beginning of 90s, in Ukraine we had our first revolution on Maidan, which essentially was called the Revolution on Granite because Ukrainians wanted to leave Soviet Union. And that revolution, that protest, was first of all about preventing the signing of the new treaty agreement with Soviet Union, prohibiting Ukrainian warriors to fight on other lands that Soviet Union was waging wars somewhere abroad, and many other things targeted at democratization of Ukrainian Republic at that point. So it's Ukraine together with efforts of Baltic states who really forced the demolition of Soviet Union eventually. And here I would like to show you a very important map that cannot be underestimated in this context, which is about the referendum and how different regions in Ukraine voted for or against independence. And you can see that the total vote was more than 92% pro-independence, with the vast majority also on the eastern regions, which is claimed by Putin to be super pro-Russian and never willing to be part of Ukraine, voting independence. And also even Crimea, the majority people out there voted for independence. After this, I think Ukraine, as many other Soviet republics, is entering a very peculiar era. Something that I believe is really underestimated and understudied when you have to transition from the Soviet kind of economy, no democracy, different ideology, to trying and make the novel capitalistic state. When you have no experience, no developed tools for that, and what was a really dramatic part of this transition was actually the fact that many means of production, like factories and plants, have been privatized in the corrupt way through the symbiosis between the corrupt elites of the previous Soviet Union and the gangsters that arose into the 90s a lot. So that created a situation where most of the power, both political and economical, was belonging to people who you really don't want to have power. So essentially the development of the country could not go just through the constructive dialogue, which of course eventually led to another uprisings. One of the major ones marking the Second Maidan Revolution, or Orange Revolution, happening in 2004. And what that was about is essentially when one of the elections that took place that year was apparently falsified. It was the election between the representative of old elites, the literal gangster who actually served term in the prison, and the pro-European politician, pro-Atlantic politician Viktor Yushchenko, whom you can see on these photo, who was actually poisoned by Yanukovych team during that time. So people didn't want to put up with that injustice and really wanted for Ukraine to finally take the westward-looking path of development. Has gone out on the streets and protests in a very peaceful way for changing and quantifying the votes in a proper way. So eventually the re-election has been established, and actually Viktor Yushchenko won. But of course, with all his Euro-Atlantic ambitions, that was not received very well by Russia. Expectedly, because that was apparently a sign for Russia that Ukraine will get off their influence, because if you develop a democratic, independent country with strong institutions, you cannot be just puppeteered by some gangsters from Russia. And Putin started what we could see last year also, the gas wars, using gas as weapons and blackmailing Ukraine that will cut your gas, will increase prices, and so on and so forth. Well, that didn't work to deter Ukrainians from electing Yushchenko, of course. And another thing that was very important during the presidency of Viktor Yushchenko was Russian invasion of Georgia, when Russia occupied pretty major territories there, and Ukraine actually helped Georgia with both diplomatically and with weapons, with Yushchenko spending some time in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, which of course was not supported by Russia in any way. So that's another instance of how the paths were parting completely. Another peculiar development after that was that unfortunately general public somehow perhaps was not too patient for Yushchenko to take longer time to transform the country, and got disappointed very fast that things were not moving as fast as possible. And Yushchenko lost next elections, and shamefully enough, people voted for Yanukovych, the person who they really wanted to remove, or the majority. Maybe not these people, but another part of the society which was a majority. But Yanukovych, during only a few years of his rule, has shown unprecedented level of corruption and criminalizing the power in Ukraine completely. So while he tried to balance between some European promises and whatever messy conduct he was making in Ukraine, eventually he decided not to sign association with the European Union, which we all really were looking forward for him to do. And that's how another really major revolution started, which was later called a Revolution of Dignity, or Euromaidan. So I was one of those students out there, as well as other participants of our organization Ukrainian Dialogue, so you can feel free to ask questions if you are interested about some other aspects of that. But the thing was that essentially the protest started from students being unhappy to hear that no, we will not be signing association agreement, even though we all understood that association agreement doesn't lead to any immediate practical consequences for Ukraine. But it was a very important declaration for Ukraine to say that, okay, now we definitely take the democratic Western path, now we're definitely gonna become a part of Europe at some point. And for us at that point, Europe was not about, just joining an alliance or becoming more bureaucratic in some way. It was really about the idea of democracy, of free market, of strong institutions, and of the superiority of the rule of law. That's what was the symbol for us. But of course, the oppressive government didn't really want to put up with the major protests happening, and in one of the nights, essentially, the peaceful protesters, the students that were on Maidan, have been beaten up and completely physically destroyed by the special forces of police. So in that way, Yanukovych regime just wanted to suppress the resistance that has been uprising. But instead of that, they got a completely opposite result. So instead of people being scared and running to hide somewhere and saying that, oh, we don't want to be arrested, millions of people took to the streets the day after that one. I remember because the beating up happened in the night from Friday to Saturday, and we all were just looking at the morning footages from that and understanding that like we simply cannot allow ourselves to live in the country where something like that can happen, when our own government will be doing something like that to the people. And as we can see already on Sunday, that's how many people went out, all around Ukraine actually. It was marking a very interesting and very uplifting times in Ukrainian life, because not only there were people from different regions uniting, like with their mottos sounding like East and West together, but there was also this very interesting solidarity between different generations in Ukraine, because as you can imagine, our parents were someone who was growing up in Soviet Union. So in many occasions we would have some different opinions with them, but that's where the parents were standing side by side with their children. And that's where I think something that's also close to Danish society, that people will not be standing when someone offends their children. So the stakes were much, much higher after these brutal beating up. So the protesters were still trying to make it a peaceful protest, demanding, as before, signing the association and also getting those special forces punished and those who gave them order to be held responsible. But unfortunately, the regime didn't want it to stick to that rule and still kept pressing on people and using all sorts of means to destroy the resistance, and eventually using even fire and shotguns. That's why the people on Maidan had to stay really strong and protect their ability to defend their place of protest. What I would also like to draw your attention to is some numbers, because Euromaidan, as I noticed when I just arrived to Denmark several years ago, has been sometimes not pictured very well, especially when someone was listening to Russian propaganda. So first of all, most of the people taking part in Maidan had no formal political affiliation, even though it's claimed by Russian propaganda that those were some Nazis and so on and so forth. No, it's like only 8% had some affiliation, and far not all of them were on the right wing. And so it was mostly like people with a higher education, so it was people who otherwise often had an okay life actually. So it was about the ideas, not so much about the direct scarcity of something. And it was also interesting to see how it was basically 50-50 with the gender structure, and on the personal level it was always very worrying and touching to see, but like very, very worrying to see girls being so close to the danger out there. So essentially, up until the end, the protesters upheld their positions, even though they had to stand against the people armed with the shotguns, and also snipers being placed all around Maidan Square, which essentially led to more than 100 killings of people. And that, even though it was an extremely heartbreaking situation, have not stopped the resistance. And after that happened, the protesters were just started claiming that if that will not stop, we will also take arms in our hands. So I think being afraid of that, Yanukovych decided to flee the country, and of course to his friend Putin. If you want to know a little more about those events, I think a very accurate movie about that is called Winter on Fire. You can see the QR code here. It's just freely available on the YouTube, and I highly recommend you to check it out. I definitely think it's quite accurate. So, as an aftermath of Maidan, like what does it mean for Ukrainian society? Because I think it's a very crucial event, and that's also why Putin, in a major part, why Putin has decided to wage this war, because Maidan was point of no return to Russian sphere of influence. And as a direct effect on society, it has led to an increased trust within society, and Maidan itself was almost like magical place of this solidarity and brotherhood. It led to us getting to transparent and democratic elections. Like both major elections were admitted to be fully democratic by the international organizations in Ukraine. So we began our long-awaited process of European integration, and there was a very huge, and there still is, huge process of incorporation of civil society into governmental and political structures of Ukraine. And of course, like the free speech was one of the demands of the protesters, has also increased in Ukraine by really a lot. Well, of course, what you can expect from the neighbors like Russia, as a part of our uplifting, they decided to invade. And they decided to prevent Ukraine from really moving further in those designated directions. So, of course, it's all started, as you all know, with the annexation of Crimea in February 2014, and then a bit later with sending its troops without a flags to Donbass and orchestrating the so-called uprising, which was essentially just another part of the military conflict out there. So that's what has marked Russian aggression. But talking about these events, I also want to draw your attention on another point, which is the relations between Russians and Ukrainians, talking in numbers. So this is from Kiev International Institute of Sociology. And you can see in the blue graph here is the number of respondents in Ukraine who says that they have a positive attitude towards Russia, and the orange one who said that they have a negative attitude. And you can see that it was largely positive. It marks more than 90% having positive attitude, even though of all of those historical events that I just described to you. And the drop in that is only coinciding with the Russian war against Ukraine. So, and even then, it's like it's not a stable trend, and it's still 50% treats what's called ordinary Russians very fine, of course, up until the full-scale invasion. So that was the attitude, and here I want to show you side by side the attitude of Russian society to Ukraine. So you can see in the orange is the positive attitude within Russian society to Ukraine, which, as you can see here, has always been lower than in Ukraine, which I think emphasizes very well that all those myths about so-called alleged Russophobia in Ukraine and so on is nothing but a construct of Russian propaganda. And instead, it also emphasizes how Russian society, I think, having the effects of their culture, customs, and imperialistic attitudes combined with Putin's propaganda, has not been very favorable to Ukrainians all along, actually, not only when it came to the military aggression of Russia. So, yeah, this myth of brotherly nations is also another construct, essentially. I would like to end my talk on something that's very much relating to the modern Ukraine and what is modern Ukraine, what is civil society, how Ukrainians view different democratic values. What is it for us? And I can show you the results of the research has been done by Alliance of Democracies, Danish organization led by Anders Fogh Rasmussen, and Latana, the Agency for Sociological Research. So you can see that Ukrainians score very high on on the questions of how important the democracy, how important the equality within society, how important is the rule of law and fair elections. And it's actually, on most of these points, it's on average even higher than an average respondent in Europe, which I think just emphasizes that the current generation of Ukrainians don't have those things for granted. All of that has been fought for in the previous generation, in our generation, and we don't know very well that these are not things that you are just born with, and you have to fight for them and maintain them. And on that, I would like to thank you for your attention, but also to thank Denmark and Europe in general for your huge help in this fight, and for keeping your support, for keeping your interests. So thank you so much for standing by our side.